As you can all see, I am now back in London after my journey to Kuala Lumpur, to Malaysia, a fascinating, vibrant, optimistic country, obviously undergoing an economic transformation, a country with enormous self-confidence and pride in its recent achievements, and a country, by the way, where standards of courtesy and service are off the scale, certainly compared with anywhere in Europe today that I know. Well, I'll probably be saying more about my time in Malaysia shortly and my impressions of the country, but in the meantime, after a 13-hour flight, I am back to doing programmes here in London, where, by the way, I'm glad to have returned. And, well, it was a 13-hour flight. I've had some rest since. I'm not going to pretend that I am entirely myself, so bear with me if there's sort of rough edges around this video. Please understand why. But anyway, it is good to be back, and it is good to be doing programs again from my usual home base. For the record, I do not have any plans to journey anywhere outside London between now and Christmas. That, of course, all of that may be subject to change, but if it does change, then I will let you all know days well in advance. Anyway, having returned to London, I found that the world situation was not that different from how it had been when I left Kuala Lumpur, which is that the focus of global attention continues to be this conflict, this incredible conflict that's playing out on the Israel-Lebanese border. And Israel continues to conduct bomb strikes, airstrikes, and artillery strikes on Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon and in southern Beirut. There was reports that Israel has conducted an airstrike on a position in central Beirut. Not clear what that was. Hezbollah's forces are mostly concentrated in southern Beirut, but anyway, no doubt we'll get clarification. There were some reports early today that Israeli special forces had crossed the border into Lebanon, and there had been some fighting taking place in some of Hezbollah's tunnels. Hezbollah apparently also has a complex and elaborate tunnel network comparable in some respects to Hamas's in Gaza. Anyway, there were some reports to that effect, but they were not, I think, terribly reliable. But all the indications are that at some point within the next couple of days, Israel is going to begin a ground operation. Though I should also say that reports about the numbers of Israeli troops on the Israeli side of the border suggest that for the moment at least, that operation, if it takes place, is going to be on a relatively limited scale. However, it ought to be also said, if the Israeli army enters southern Lebanon and Hezbollah resistance turns out to be weaker than perhaps had been once assumed, then the Israelis might decide to reinforce. Alternatively, if Hezbollah resistance is very strong, then that might lead the Israelis to reinforce again, since the pattern of so many wars, as I've noticed, is that people are unwilling to cut losses and draw back. They do sometimes have a tendency to reinforce, even when things are going wrong, and even to the point of reinforcing failure. So I have to say, there may be a ground operation. In fact, there probably will be over the next few hours. In fact, I'm confident that there will be over the next few hours. It might initially be limited in scope, but I think it will almost certainly increase in scale as the fighting on the border intensifies. Now, a lot depends on Hezbollah and its deputy leader, a person, its current deputy leader, Mr. Qasem, has come forward and has made statements to the effect that Hezbollah has endured massive losses. Its top leadership have been destroyed. Hassan Nasrallah himself is dead, but Hezbollah survives. It is intact. It will go on fighting. It will go on fighting until there is a ceasefire, not just in Lebanon, but in Gaza as well. In other words, they will continue their rocket strikes into Israel until there is a ceasefire in Gaza, and that they are, in other words, still fully engaged in the battle. Now, I find that a most interesting statement because it indirectly confirms that there have been concerns and doubts expressed, of course we're not told by whom, as to Hezbollah's unity and its cohesion. Certainly it has been, as Qasem admits, subject to massive attacks by Israel. And of course it's seen its top leaders, many of its top leaders killed, people like Nasrallah himself, but other top leaders as well. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, for a militia, this is a huge test whether it can maintain discipline and cohesion, or whether it will start to break down under the pressure. And if, of course, it does break down, then that will change the entire situation on the Israel-Lebanese border, and it will change the situation in Lebanon itself, the political situation in Lebanon, and in the wider Middle East. However, if Hezbollah is able to maintain its internal unity and its organization, if it's able to limit defections from amongst its fighters or prevent defections amongst its fighters, if it's able to keep fighting and remain intact as an organization, then, as I discussed in my program yesterday, over time, the longer Hezbollah survives, the more the balance of advantage will tilt towards it. It's exactly the same as what has happened with Hamas in Gaza. The Israelis launched their offensive against Hamas in October of last year. Their objective was to destroy Hamas. A year has passed. Hamas is still in existence. And I think most people would say that the fact that it has withstood the storm, even though large numbers of its fighters have been killed, significant parts of its organization have been destroyed, and many of its leaders have been killed as well. The fact that it has endured means that politically, diplomatically, it is in a stronger position than it was in this time last year, even if militarily it has been severely damaged. That is the calculus of this type of war. I remember that Henry Kissinger, not a person I like to quote from, but undoubtedly an intelligent man, made this very same point back in the 1960s about the Viet Cong. They win by not losing, whereas those who are opposing them, who want to defeat them, in that case the United States, lose by not winning. So it's the same calculus exactly with Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah has now acted to appoint a new leader, and the leader in question is Hashem Safieddin, who is apparently the son-in-law of Hassan Nasrallah. He is himself a cleric, as Nasrallah was. He's said to be a successful and effective orator, and he's also said to be in some ways a more flexible figure than Nasrallah was in terms of his approach to leadership. So quite what that means, I have absolutely no idea. Safieddin appears to be also very closely connected to the Iranians, and apparently he has studied in Qom, the city in Iran, which is the intellectual hub of modern Shiism. So anyway, he has been appointed. Hezbollah has been taking measures, in other words, to rebuild its leadership after the disaster it has experienced over the last 2 weeks. Now, we will see whether all of this is enough, and I think a number of points need to be made about Hezbollah, which I noticed that some people who perhaps one could qualify as supporters and even admirers, perhaps, of Hezbollah remain in denial about. Firstly, there is incontestable evidence now that the organization has been significantly penetrated by Israeli intelligence. Now, we don't know fully how it has been done, but all the evidence that I have seen strongly points to a deterioration and atrophy in Hezbollah's once extremely effective internal security apparatus. And I have to say that I suspect that after Hezbollah's success in the 2006 conflict with Israel, a degree of complacency and atrophy set in as the leaders, Hezbollah's leaders, sought to leverage the victory in order to secure Hezbollah's position in Lebanon itself and intervene in the Syrian civil war. In other words, they took their eye off the ball, allowing things with Hezbollah itself to deteriorate. And I suspect many of the toughest, most reliable commanders were probably sent to Syria and fought there, and some of them may have died. And anyway, it may be that their successors were not quite up to the standard of those that were lost. So that is one thing. It also seems to me that there has been a certain ossification in the leadership of Hezbollah itself. Hassan Nasrallah is not the first leader of Hezbollah. He succeeded his predecessor, who was also, by the way, assassinated by the Israelis 32 years ago, but he has been leading Hezbollah continuously since then. And I have to say, I was struck by the fact that most of the inner leadership group, the people who the Israelis have managed to kill over the last 2 or 3 weeks, have been men in their 60s. Well, that would have meant that they will have gained experience, a huge amount of experience and political knowledge. I find it difficult to believe that they are as close to the fighters, the actual men who would engage Israel in battle, as perhaps they were all those years ago, almost 20 years ago, when they fought Israel to a standstill in the 2006 war, and when they would have been men in their 40s. So it looks as if there was a closing up of the team, that it became ossified and complacent. But I think it almost certainly goes rather further than that, because I suspect that with Hezbollah emerging from the 2006 war as by far the most powerful actor in Lebanon itself, as a major player in the conflict in Syria. I suspect that some of its operatives decided to leverage this very powerful position that Hezbollah had achieved to their own material advantage. And to say it frankly, I think probably corruption began to spread, and this would have made it easier for the Israelis to infiltrate the organization successfully in the way that they did. Now, it's important to remember that Hezbollah remains a militia. It is not an army of a functioning state, and though I have no doubt it has its own internal compliance forces, they're not themselves subject to the same kind of controls that one would expect in a state, and they might not be fully up to the task of dealing with corruption, especially if some of the people who were engaging in it were well connected to members of the leadership team. So I am not saying that these problems, the problems of ossification of leadership, of complacency, of corruption, were such as to undermine the organization as a whole, or to cause it to lose all effectiveness. But clearly they are there. I think anybody who is in denial about this is deluding themselves. And the question is how extensive they are, and whether they are so extensive, whether they were so extensive as to call into question the ability of Hezbollah to mount an effective resistance to the Israelis, who remain obviously an extremely powerful, extremely well-organized force with powerful intelligence agencies, with the support of the Western powers and the United States, and with the kind of compliance systems on their side which exist in a state and which a militia realistically cannot replicate. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't know how deep-seated or extensive these problems are. But everything now depends upon this. Now, when wars like this begin, when one side, in this case Israel, goes all in, conducts massive operations, very dramatic, very ferocious in their early days, it seems to me that one of two things is going to happen. Either the success, the initial success, which can be spectacular and dramatic, will continue. The other side will become demoralized, its cohesion will collapse, and then you will have breakdown. And the paradigm example of this, I would suggest, is the German invasion of France in the spring and summer of 1940, where it became almost immediately clear, as soon as the Germans attacked, that the French army, which had just 20 years before won the First World War, which had been widely assumed to be the most powerful army in Europe, that this army had atrophied intellectually and morally and was no longer fit to withstand the kind of attack that the far better organized and far better motivated Germans had launched against it. So we could have that scenario, one in which rapidly a collapse happens and the victor walks away with all the spoils. In the case of the German invasion of France, after about 6 weeks and with minimal losses. Or alternatively, it might be different. It might be like what happened the following year in the summer of 1941, when the same German army, which had defeated France, attacked the Soviet Union. And there again, the first couple of weeks led to spectacular victories, confident predictions of the rapid collapse of the other side, the Soviet Union. Only it turned out otherwise, and the Germans found themselves trapped in an endless war of grinding attrition, which of course ended in their catastrophic defeat. So these are the two paradigm events, and we've seen how similar things have happened to each of these examples since then. In the Middle East, for example, we have the dramatic victory, very similar in some ways in its speed and sensational effect, the dramatic victory that Israel won in 1967 in the Six-Day War, when it defeated pretty much all of the Arab states, as I said, in just 6 days. Or you can get many other examples of the opposite thing happening. The Lebanon war that Israel waged in 1982, which also started with spectacular success. PLO was driven out of Beirut. A government led by Shamir Gemayel was pro-Israeli Lebanese politician and militia leader installed in Beirut, and then everything began to go wrong, and Israel found itself trapped in a prolonged war of attrition, which eventually it lost, causing it to leave Lebanon completely. A war of attrition, which, by the way, birthed Hezbollah. And of course, there have been other wars like that in the Middle East. In 1991, the Western powers, the United States, defeated Saddam Hussein's army. Again, that was a relatively rapid victory, similar to the German victory in France in 1940. But there have been other wars which have also led to grinding attrition, which have backfired on those who have launched them. The war that the United States and its allies launched against Iraq in 2003, the wars in Syria and Libya, and of course, as of today, I can't say which of these two wars this war is going to be. What I am going to say is this: with every day that passes and Hezbollah keeps fighting, the pendulum is going to swing gradually more in Hezbollah's favor and against Israel. Its problems will start to be sorted out, and it will begin to organize probably more effectively. And if it keeps fighting, the morale of its fighters will gradually recover, and it will probably start to attract support from outside, mostly from the other Shia militias around the Middle East, the militias in Iraq, for example, but also from its Iranian allies. And the same, I suspect, will be true in Iran. We have seen some of the same signs of decay and disorganization in Iran that we've seen with Hezbollah. And I suspect here one of the key figures has been the newly elected president of Iran, President Pezeshkian. Now, he's been recently going to the United Nations, talking about resuming the nuclear negotiations. He's been talking about some kind of détente between Iran and the Western powers. He's even floated ideas about sanctions relief, Iran being granted sanctions relief. And whilst I don't think he's done anything that breaks with the policies of the Iranian leadership, by his own admission, he has been a major force. He has argued strongly within the Iranian political leadership for moderation and restraint in the face of the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. And he's now bitterly complaining that all of these things that he said, all of these positions that he took in the internal debates that were taking place in Tehran, that they were all for nothing, that he had been led by the Americans several times to believe that a ceasefire in Gaza was around the corner, only it turned out that there was no prospect of a ceasefire. The Prime Minister Netanyahu was not interested in that idea. And he's also recently said that he also had been led to believe that the Israelis had agreed to the American-French proposals for a ceasefire in the border war between Israel and Hezbollah. And he's now speaking very bitterly about how all of these promises and all these assurances that he was given have turned out to be wrong, and about how the decision to proceed with the assassination of Nasrallah was taken by Prime Minister Netanyahu whilst he was in the United States, attending the General Assembly session, and how the bombs that were used to destroy the bunker in which Nasrallah was meeting and undertaking his discussions with apparently an Iranian general from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that those bombs, supposedly up to 80 of them, were supplied to Israel by the United States. Now, all of this is very interesting, but I would just say that I suspect that Pezeshkian's conduct over the last few months has, to some extent at least, contributed to the disarray in Tehran. It has made it more difficult for the Iranians to come to clear decisions about what they needed to do in the unfolding crisis. Pezeshkian's predecessor, Ebrahim Raisi, whatever you may think of him and of his domestic politics, had a much more clear-eyed understanding of Middle Eastern realities than Pezeshkian appears to have had. I think Raisi would have needed no persuasion that assurances coming from Washington are not to be taken altogether seriously, and that had Raisi been there, we would have probably seen more decisive action from Iran than we have seen up to now. Now, saying all of this, I have to also say that it seems to me that Pezeshkian's admissions, which highlight the role that he has been taking in Iran up to now, must have significantly weakened his position in Tehran, and might indeed even put into question his ability to remain Iranian president for much longer. There must be many people in Tehran who are telling him and who are telling the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, that Pezeshkian was unbelievably naive and simply didn't understand the implacable quality of the people that he was dealing with in Washington and Israel. I personally would not be surprised if Pezeshkian, who's previously hinted that he might step down if he's unable to execute on his program, the program upon which he elected, I personally would not be surprised if he ends up doing, at some point over the next few weeks, that very thing. Anyway, if that happens, then it seems to me that it could be that we will start to see a solidification of the situation in Iran, and perhaps stronger action being taken by the Iranians. Perhaps the deployment of forces to Lebanon which they were talking about yesterday, and which the Iranian army chief has again been talking about today. And, well, that might also lead to this situation in the Middle East continuing to develop more towards a long war, an attrition war, the kind of war that Israel needs to avoid, rather than to the quick victory that the Israelis may be hoping to achieve after the successes that they've had over the last 3 weeks. And of course, then there is the Americans. And here again, we see further signs of disarray because there are reports that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is absolutely furious with reports that he's with the news about Nasrallah's assassination. Apparently, right up until the moment when the decision to assassinate Nasrallah was made, the Israelis, or at least Prime Minister Netanyahu, were leading people in the United States along, telling them that a ceasefire was on the brink of being agreed, that Israel was supportive of the American-French proposal for a 21-day ceasefire. Supposedly, and of course this is all originating from media reports, Netanyahu was simply stringing the Americans along. And when the Americans learnt that, in fact, even as he'd been giving them to think that he was preparing to agree a ceasefire, Netanyahu was actually making all the arrangements leading up to the actual assassination of Nasrallah. Apparently for some people in the United States, that came as a shock. And the Pentagon in particular, which is overextended already as a result of the Ukraine war, apparently there are many people there, including Lloyd Austin himself, who are very, very angry about this. Those are the reports. You can believe them or not as you choose. The Iranians don't believe them. I, by the way, do. I think that there almost certainly were people in Washington who knew exactly what was coming. Tony Blinken, probably one, possibly one. Maybe the president himself. Whenever situations like this arise, his visceral response is to back the Israelis to the hilt, as he has just done. But I would not be surprised myself at all if the Pentagon, the uniformed military, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and people like that had indeed been cut out of the picture, precisely because it was known that if they were briefed in advance, they would strenuously object to what has just been done to the assassination of Nasrallah and to the Israeli plans for a wider war in Lebanon. And it is not difficult to understand why the Pentagon might think that. I said that they are hugely overextended by the conflict in Ukraine. We're now getting reports that the United States has run short of pretty much many of its key weapons. There's shortages of artillery shells, shortages apparently of HIMARS rockets. So I've heard. Apparently a large proportion of the ATACMS stockpile has been used up. And most importantly, there are critical shortages in air defense systems, in Patriot missiles in particular. Production of Patriot missile interceptors has proved very difficult to increase, and the result is that the Pentagon really does not want to be drawn into a long war in the Middle East, even as the Chinese continue to build up their forces, and even as the Russians continue to make further advances in Ukraine, because the Pentagon understands that a long war in the Middle East is going to stretch its resources to breaking point. And this brings me back, finally, to my last and most important point. Israel cannot afford a long war. If it goes in, it must achieve victory quickly. By quickly, I would give it about 3 months until the end of this year. If there is a war in Lebanon and it goes on beyond that, if Hezbollah keeps fighting, if it is able to continue to send and launch rockets into Israel, if the Iranians do become involved in some form, if they start to send ground forces to Lebanon and those forces start to participate in the fighting as well, well, then Israel, which is, as it is always important to remember, a small country, doesn't have the resources by itself to sustain a long war of that kind indefinitely, over and above the war, the unfinished war that is still being fought in Gaza. And it can't rely fully on the support of its allies in such a conflict. I've said that the Pentagon is conscious of its resource constraints, the shortages of air defense missiles. It almost certainly will not want to be drawn into a longer war, a long war in the Middle East against the Shia forces there and Iran. It knows how deeply unpopular that would be in the United States. And of course, that knowledge, that awareness of the unpopularity of such a long-term, open-ended commitment, that is known by many members of the American political class as well. And that, of course, discounts the very real possibility that things could go wrong in all kinds of unexpected ways, that the Iranians might close the Straits of Hormuz to shipping, imposing a blockade on a third of the world's oil supply, which would trigger a massive economic shock, or that things might get even more dangerous with hypersonic missiles being used and potentially Iran developing weapons I don't even want to name because of their enormous power, and which Israel, of course, already possesses, and which it might in that case be strongly tempted to use. So Israel cannot afford a long war. The United States cannot afford a long war. Political divisions in the United States over supporting Israel in such a long war might potentially increase, creating major stresses in the American political system. And of course, the same applies even more so in Europe. So, for all of these reasons, if Israel makes a decision to continue to launch a ground operation to try to destroy Hezbollah once and for all, then it needs to win fast. I'm not saying it needs to win in a few days or a few weeks, but if by the new year decisive results have not been achieved, then I think we will see the entire balance of the war tilt and move decisively, though probably gradually, in favor of the other side. Now, that brings me to my very last point of all, which is that given that this is the reality, a wise policy for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government to follow, I appreciate some people will not take well to the fact that I'm giving Prime Minister Netanyahu advice. And of course, he's not going to pay any attention, even if he's aware of these programs, which he almost certainly isn't. But anyway, I think I'm going to just make this observation now. A wise policy, it seems to me, would be to cash in the winnings which Israel has achieved and to stop now. Nasrallah is dead. Hezbollah has been shaken to its core. Iran has massively lost face. There were probably huge recriminations raging between Iran and its Shia allies, and amongst those allies and within Tehran. It could be that this would be a good moment for Israel to stop, return to the diplomatic track, perhaps make efforts to resume its efforts to achieve diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. After all, the Israelis could tell the Saudis, you've gone to all that trouble to reconcile with the Iranians, but look at what a disorganized and chaotic and ultimately weak state they truly are. Why not do this deal instead with us? We've just demonstrated how strong we are. It seems to me that if Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet could bring themselves to do that, they would come out the conclusive winners from this affair. I don't expect them to do so. I'm confident that if they hear this advice, they will not heed it. I suspect that they will plunge on. And based on recent experience in the Middle East, events going all the way back to the 1982 Lebanon war, I suspect, this is my belief, I suspect that over the next months, at some point next year, it will be understood, it will come to be understood, including in Israel itself, that they have made a disastrous mistake and that they've drawn Israel into a long war which will not be to Israel's advantage. Anyway, there we are. We will see what the Israelis do over the next couple of days. Some kind of ground operation, I think, is all but a certainty. To repeat again, they need to win fast. They have a couple of months, a window extending perhaps to the new year or perhaps to the new president's inauguration in the United States at the end of January. But after that, the clock will start to turn against them. Time will start to turn against them. And in the meantime, of course, with every day that passes, with every hour that passes, the risks of an all-out war in the Middle East grow, and the possibility of that becomes greater. And my own view is that if we end up in that kind of situation, that would not be to Israel's advantage either. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about the situation in the Middle East today. I'm now going to return to that other war, the war that's being fought out in Ukraine, which the Russians, as now everybody agrees, are winning. And I'd like to make a point here, a few points which follow from the previous one, which is that if Western wars, including this last one, the one that we see being played out between Israel and Hezbollah, starts spectacularly with massive shock and awe tactics, leaders of the other side being killed in large numbers, sometimes territory seized, but then turn into grinding attrition wars, which the West loses. Russian strategy is completely different. And by the way, this goes back a long, long way. It's nothing new. The Russians, as was once said back in the 19th century, if they're slow on to get onto their horses, when they do, they ride very fast. Or, as the Russian general who led the Russian army to victory in the Napoleonic Wars is supposed to have said, by the way, for the record, I believe this was actually written by a scriptwriter. I don't think he said it, but if, as Kutuzov, the Russian general, is supposed to have said, it doesn't matter who wins the first battle in a war. What matters is who wins the last one. Anyway, the Russians start quietly and slowly, and then they build up. And that's exactly what we are seeing play out in the conflict in Ukraine at the moment. There's lots of people who are going around saying, including in Russia at the moment, by the way, that Russia should borrow a leaf from the Israeli book, go all out, be utterly ruthless, conduct decapitation strikes, do that kind of thing, and that would have resulted in a quick and decisive victory. Well, there are multiple reasons, political, economic, military, why I personally believe that had the Russians done that, it would have ended badly for them. I think, to say it straightforwardly, I think that kind of military operation almost certainly would not have succeeded. It's quite likely that the Russians would indeed, in that case, have got bogged down in Ukraine. And the international mood about the war, which has been very increasingly favorable to the Russians and which has enabled them to not only keep their economy going, but actually to expand it, even as the war has gone on. I think the international mood would have almost certainly turned very hostile, and the Russians could very well have found themselves critically isolated and without friends and facing the full weight of Western sanctions on their own. Just saying. But putting all that aside, it is not the Russian style to conduct wars like that. Even during the Second World War, for example, when situation was far more existential than it is today, the Russians never made any effort to conduct decapitation strikes or anything of that nature against the German leadership, though it would have actually not been a particularly difficult thing to do, but they never sought to do it. They fought the war in that grinding attrition way that ultimately delivered them total victory. And it is the way they are conducting the war in Ukraine now. All sorts of circumstances, all sorts of circumstances, economic, geographic, geopolitical, diplomatic, serve to push them in that direction. But I'm also going to suggest that it is an ingrained aspect of their war-making culture, and given how successful they tend to be in wars, I think we shouldn't discount the effectiveness of it as well. Anyway, with that little that little lecture, let's turn to what is going on in the war itself. And before I do, I'd like to reference Simplicus the Thinker's recent blog piece on Substack. Simplicus the Thinker has done an analysis of the personnel losses of the two sides. And by his calculation, the Russians have killed in action, around 100,000 men, 100,000 men killed in action, 50 to 60,000 irrecoverable wounded, 300,000 light wounded, giving total casualties of 450,000. I think that is about right. I'm, by the way, by the standards of Russian wars, these are light losses. Losses on a scale that Russia can definitely absorb, and for many reasons, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. I believe that the heaviest losses were experienced over the course of the second half of 2022 and first half of 2023, and that the losses now are running at a much lower level than these figures might imply. But 100,000 dead, 50 to 60,000 severely wounded, 300,000 light wounded, of whom the vast majority of the light wounded will have recovered, and many of them will have rejoined the battle, just saying. Now, Simplicius the Thinker estimates Ukrainian losses at 320,000 killed in action, 180,000 severely wounded, and 750,000 light wounded. And that gives a total loss of 1.2 to 1.3 million. I think Simplicius the Thinker has got Russian losses roughly right. I sense that his calculations for Ukrainian losses are too high, significantly too high. I'm not going to substitute my figures for his, because bluntly, I don't have any. I have no doubt that Ukrainian losses are much heavier than Russian. All the facts bear that out. The Russians have far more artillery, far more shells, far more bombs, far better equipped. I think they're better organized ultimately than the Ukrainians are. And the Ukrainians now have the further problem that they're so short of armored vehicles that many of their troops are apparently being deployed to battle in commercial vehicles where they are in deadly danger to Russian drone and artillery and airstrikes. But I still feel that these losses that Simplicius the Thinker is giving for the Ukrainians are too high. But however high Ukrainian losses are, they are unsustainable. As David Ignatius correctly said in his recent piece in the Washington Post, Ukraine is bleeding out. 100,000 killed in action is a relatively small figure for Russia relative to its historic wars. It'd be an enormous figure in the United States or in the West, but here we're talking about Russia, and the psychology and the culture is profoundly different. And of course, on this issue, the Russians consider this to be a war which is existential for themselves. So they can absorb losses at this level without feeling significant pressure. But for the Ukrainians, the losses that they're experiencing are unsustainable and irreplaceable, and they know it. So what is happening on the battlefronts? And we have had lots of news over the last 24 hours, and they're all consistent with the recent trends that we have seen in battle after battle. Now, there's been lots of talk about how the Russians have surrounded Vuhledar, and I don't think anybody any longer seriously doubts that that is indeed the case. The Russians have established, in effect, a circuit around Vuhledar. Their troops have completely surrounded Vuhledar. No supplies can enter. and no one can escape. So the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar, 1,500 according to most estimates, perhaps as many as 2,000 according to what one Ukrainian official is supposed to have said, are trapped. There have been many reports that the Russians have been trying to get the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar to lay down their arms and to surrender. Now, that may or may not be the case. I don't know, but a rather interesting thing has happened, which is that one particular Ukrainian officer, Colonel Ivan Vinik, who we were told was the leader, the commander of the 72nd Brigade, the core unit defending Vuhledar, that he has been dismissed from his post and appointed to another post. Now, we're not told what that post is, and it's clear that he is not in disgrace. He's actually been congratulated by the Ukrainian leadership for his heroic defense of Vuhledar, and he's written a very warm message to the men of the 72nd Brigade, talking about how wonderful it was for him, what an honor it was for him to lead them into battle and to assure them that victory eventually will be theirs. So the proprieties have been preserved. But the rumours pushed by people like Butuzev, the Ukrainian commentator, and Mariana Bezuglaya, the dissident Ukrainian MP, is that he was sacked because he tried to arrange for the withdrawal of the 72nd Brigade from Vuhledar, and that he tried to organize a retreat towards the village of Bogoyavlenka to the north, and this was unacceptable to the Ukrainian command. And perhaps, given that he's been dismissed now, that he was trying to negotiate with the Russians the term of the surrender of the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar. By the way, I believe that Vinik himself is not in Vuhledar. There were some reports about a week ago that the Ukrainian commanders in Vuhledar had withdrawn and had gone to Bogoyavlenka, and I'm guessing that that is where Vinik himself is. Just saying. Well, all of this is possible. Another possibility, of course, is that with the 72nd Brigade about to be lost, we have a commander, an experienced commander, Ivan Vinik, without a brigade, and that the fact that the Ukrainian High Command has just confirmed his dismissal is simply a way of acknowledging that the 72nd Brigade it will soon cease to exist, so that it doesn't need a commander anymore. Anyway, one way or the other, the Battle of Vuhledar is coming to an end. Now, yesterday, there were reports that with the negotiations for the surrender of the 72nd Brigade having broken down, the Russians gave the Ukrainians an ultimatum to surrender and told them that if they didn't do so, then it would be all out. There would be a massive attack by the Russians on the remaining Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar, and that no more surrender proposals to them would be made. And it may be that explains why a couple of hours later we started to get videos again which seem to show heavy Russian artillery and rocket strikes on Vuhledar, heavy bombing on Vuhledar, those parts of Vuhledar which remain under Ukrainian control. And I've noticed that some of the mapping projects have now published amendments to their maps, and they show more than half of Vuhledar now having passed fully under the control of the Russians. So that's the situation in Vuhledar. By the time you watch this program, it could be that resistance in Vuhledar has collapsed and that the Russians are in complete control of the town. My own view is that the Russians already control all the strong positions in Vuhledar. Probably there are still large numbers of Ukrainian troops dispersed in parts of Vuhledar, some of them still resisting and still fighting. But that what we're looking at now is an intense mopping up operation rather than a formal offensive to capture a town which has already been lost. One way or the other, this whole affair, as far as I'm concerned, leaves a very bad taste. Definitely Vuhledar was a strategically important place. It had been successfully defended by the Ukrainians for more than 2.5 years. Its control by the Ukrainians interfered with Russian logistics in a serious way. It made Russian advances towards Zaporozhye, the city of Zaporozhye, very difficult. It also prevented the Russians achieving control of southern Donbass, and it secured the positions, Ukrainian positions, in places like Kurakovo. But it should have become obvious at least 2 months ago that Kurakovo the Vuhledar was becoming undefendable. The moment Novomykhailovka fell at the start of the summer, the village of Novomykhailovka further north fell at the start of last summer. Preparations should have been made to evacuate Vuhledar. When the village of Konstantinovka, which lies on the main road, the main supply road to Vuhledar, fell, that would have been, in my opinion, the correct moment to withdraw the 72nd Brigade and to abandon Vuhledar. And, well, if there was any case for going on fighting, certainly the last moment, in my opinion, the moment when any argument about whether or not to hold on to Vuhledar should have been settled, was when the Russians, about 2 weeks ago, captured the village of Odyanye and started their attack on the coal mine, South Donbass number 3, which lies close to the village of Bogoyavlenka and which dominates the main supply road, the one remaining paved supply road from Bogoyavlenka to Vuhledar itself. That happened about, a week ago, more than a week ago. The Russian attack on coal mine South Donbass number 3 began even before then. The Ukrainians at that point should have pulled all their men out of Vuhledar. Nothing militarily has been achieved by keeping them there. 1,500 to 2,000 men are being sacrificed. Either they will be killed or they will be severely wounded and taken into they will be taken into captivity. There was no military logic in seeking to defend Vuhledar in the way that has been done. But this repeats the consistent pattern of Zelensky's government ever since the conflict started. The Ukrainians never retreat from undefendable ground, and they pay a massive disproportionate price for defending it. And of course, rationalizations for clinging on can always be provided. Rationalizations like the need to avoid the loss of Vuhledar whilst Zelensky was in New York, for example. But these are simply rationalizations. They don't change the reality of the war. They don't change the ultimate course of the battle. They don't achieve even the political objectives that they are supposed to achieve. So this has been a pointless, mindless sacrifice of the lives of brave men to no purpose that I can see whatsoever. Anyway, there we go. That is Vuhledar. I'm not going to say more about it in this program. Let's move on to what is going on in other places on the battlefronts. So we have further news from the Kurakovo, Sverdlikovo direction. And the key story here is that the Russians have now entered Tsukurinye, village that lies between Sverdlikovo and Kurakovo, and they've apparently advanced deep into Tsukurinye. It's a village, it's a big village, so we're not talking about a huge place, but they've advanced deep into Tsukurinye, advanced along the railway lines, apparently, as the Russians like to do. So they've advanced deep into Tsukurinye. They're storming this village from two directions. I'm going to guess that within hours or days, Tsukurinye will fall under complete Russian control. And, well, it's possible that when that happens, the Russians will decide to push further south. There are two villages, Novoselidivka and Izmailovka, located immediately to the south. The fall of Tsukurinye, I think, basically ends prospects for the Ukrainians to continue to defend themselves in the small town of Girnik, south of Ukrainsk, which the Russians are already storming. And of course, the fall of Tsukurinye opens the way for the Russians to attack Selidovo from the south. We will come to that, by the way, because there's been some rather interesting information from Selidovo, which is not entirely easy to assess. But anyway, there we go. So, a crisis for the Ukrainians in Tsukurinye. And in fact, there are even some reports that the Ukrainian troops who are defending Tsukurinye are effectively surrounded, that whatever Ukrainian troops are in Tsukurinye, they are in effect in some sort of a cauldron. I'm not sure that that is correct, by the way, but those are some of the reports that we see. Now, further north in Selidovo, where there's been intense fighting, there's been a most astonishing video which has been published from a drone, and one would be interested to know whose drone, whether it was a Russian drone or a Ukrainian drone. But the drone was hovering above the central area of Selidovo, close to a monument located in the center of Selidovo, a monument which shows it looks to me a MiG-19 fighter jet, but, maybe I'm wrong, Soviet-era fighter jet. And it shows a deserted road, completely empty road, no traffic, no sign of anybody moving along that road, except for one person, which is a figure on a motorcycle. And it's claimed that this individual who is driving along this deserted road, this empty road, right in the middle of Selidovo, on a motorcycle, is a Russian soldier, presumably an assault fighter. The Russians regularly use motorcycles in carrying out assaults, or perhaps just possibly a courier. Anyway, there he is. He's driving along the main road, one of these roads at the center of Selidovo, close to this monument, where, according to the mapping projects, he has no right to be, if he is indeed Russian and a soldier. And if the Russians really are there, if this soldier on the motorcycle didn't just lose his way and wasn't driving through Ukrainian-controlled roads, though I have to say, if that is the case, then it's surprising that nobody appears to have been firing at him or trying to take him prisoner or anything of that kind. But anyway, if he was driving on territory which the Russians have just occupied or captured, then that must mean that at least the eastern part of Selidovo, up to and including areas in central Selidovo, are under Russian control. In other words, that the Russians have advanced far deeper into Selidovo itself than anybody has assumed. Now, as I've said many times, the fact that we're not getting reports from a particular town or location where fighting is taking place doesn't mean that fighting isn't in fact taking place in that town or location. It could be that even whilst all the attention has been on Vuhledar, on Ukrainsk and Tsukurinye and places like that, the Russian army has been gradually taking more and more of Selidovo under control. I will say this, one film made by a drone, interesting as it is, might not in itself give us the whole picture about what is going on in a particular town. I remember during the fighting in Krasnogorovka, there was very similar film of a Russian tank, one of those turtle tanks with all the shields, driving through deserted roads in Krasnogorovka. There's no sign of any Ukrainian response. Nobody was shooting at it. Nothing was happening. And several people, myself included, thought that that must mean that the Russians were in control of that area in Krasnogorovka. And it turned out that things were not quite that straightforward. The Russians, as I suspect, did have a significant presence there, but there were still Ukrainian troops occupying positions in this general area where this tank was located. But I wonder whether with the case of Selidovo the same is true. And bear in mind, we're not talking about a tank, but a single man on a motorcycle. Anyway, we will find out, no doubt, in due course. But one thing is indisputable. The Russians seem to be on the brink of capturing Tsukurinye. If they capture Tsukurinye, they will be in a position to advance south, sort out and capture places like Girnik and maybe Izmailivka. And they've already established, apparently, a presence north of Tsukurinye on the immediate outskirts, the southern outskirts of Selidovo, and quite possibly what this affair with the man on the motorcycle tells us is that they've advanced deep inside Selidovo already, that significant parts of Selidovo are already under Russian control. And, well, there are lots of reports that the Russians have been pushing westwards from Marinivka, north of Selidovo, pushing towards the roads and railway lines north of Selidovo. The Russians, as we see with the capture of Tsukurinye, the imminent capture of Tsukurinye, are located in all sorts of positions to the south and potentially west of Selidovo. Selidovo is at very real risk now of being taken into operational encirclement. And again, the right thing for the Ukrainians to do is to acknowledge this reality and to retreat from Selidovo, even if that means abandoning the town to Russian control. They waited too long. They refused to do that in Vuhledar with the results that we see. I suspect they will refuse to do that in Selidovo, and at a time when the Ukrainian army is, by every account, desperately short of men and machines. More of those men and machines are going to be lost in Selidovo, once more, to no useful purpose. So anyway, that's the situation in Selidovo. Now, there have been further reports of the Russians engaging in further advances immediately to the south of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. There's now pictures of Russian soldiers in both Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, the two villages to the northeast of Novogrodivka. I have no doubt that the Russians have also captured the village of Nikolaevka, located to the north of these two villages, and the village of Grodivka along the main road, which I believe the Russians captured some weeks ago, in fact. There are reports that the Russians west of Novogrodivka are now pushing hard towards Sukhe Yar, another village south of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. And the Russians, as I've said, are clearing all the various fortifications south of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk. All of this tells me that the Russians intend to advance into Mirnograd. They intend to start the fight for Mirnograd. Enter Mirnograd itself, Mirnograd being the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, before the start of the autumn rains. My own view is that the Battle of Pokrovsk will be over well before the new year, that the Russians will be in complete control of Pokrovsk by that time, certainly by the new year, and that the Russians will probably also have captured Kurakovo and other places by then also. The map of Ukraine is going to look very different at the end of the year from what it does now. And further east, the Russian Defense Ministry today has announced that the village of Nelipivka, located north of New York and south of Toretsk, has fallen under Russian control. That the Russians now completely control this village. This is news which again, this is an advance which again was missed by most of the reporting and mapping projects, but it looks as if the last remaining village south of Toretsk has now fallen under Russian control, and the Russians, by every account, are now located deep inside Toretsk itself. They control a significant area of the high-rise buildings. The Ukrainians are supposed to be conducting a counterattack to try to push the Russians back. I wonder sometimes about whether these counterattacks that the Ukrainians are said to be conducting now really are happening now, or whether they might have been counterattacks that took place weeks ago, and of which the Ukrainians are only now providing film as they try to maintain morale in the face of an imminent collapse in Toretsk itself. Just saying. There's been less news from Chasiv Yar today. There was some discussions about this from Redovka, but nothing that I found particularly new or interesting. The Ukrainians have been showing endless film of a successful defense that Ukrainian troops conducted in the area close to the Oskol River against a Russian armed assault that was supposed to have taken place there south of Kupiansk I have to say, I'm very much like the attack on Terni, which took place in the spring. The Ukrainians are milking this success, if that is what it was, for all that it is worth. Almost certainly a sign that things are going very badly everywhere else, and probably, by the way, in northern Kupiansk as well, just saying. Further south, the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed that the village of Makeyevka on the Zherebets River has now passed fully under Russian control. And, well, we're getting reports that the Russians are pushing south from Makeyevka along the Zherebets River. They captured Nevsky a couple of days ago, as we remember. They're moving further south, eventually to Terni. And I suspect that after the autumn rains, after the Rasputitsa, once the ground has hardened, and once all the villages on the Zherebets River are passed under Russian control, we will see an operation by the Russians to capture Siversk, Kupiansk itself, and the even more important town of Liman, located west of the Zherebets River, close to Slavyansk itself. And last but not least, group of forces north, despite the withdrawal from the aggregate plant, tell us that they've made further advances in the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk. Apparently, they've captured the entrances to 2 of the remaining high-rise buildings over the last 24 hours. That's what they say. And they also report that the Russians have resumed their advances in Kursk region, and they claim to have advanced by 1,300 meters. In other words, 1.3 kilometers, though again, they don't explain where that advance is. There are reports, again, reports which of course I'm unable to confirm, that the Russians are now fighting with the Ukrainians inside Sverdlikovo, village that obviously the Ukrainians need to retain control of, and that they've also begun a storming operation of Plekhovo. And to repeat, point I've made many times, Plekhovo perhaps even more important than Sverdlikovo. If the Russians are able to capture Plekhovo and Sverdlikovo, they are close to the main supply road to Suja, and they could presumably advance further, especially from Plekhovo, and capture the small villages that lie between Plekhovo and the main supply road. And at that point, the entire Kursk pocket that the Ukrainians occupied after their offensive of August, the entire Kursk pocket becomes a cauldron. It would be completely encircled. And were that to happen, by the way, in spite of the fact that I consider that this is a sideshow in terms of the overall war, but if thousands of Ukrainian troops are trapped beyond any hope of relief in Kursk, then rather like General Alauddinov, given the Chechen officer who commands the Chechen special forces who are fighting in Kursk, rather like he says, the political and psychological effects on Ukraine and indeed the West of a Ukrainian disaster in Kursk would be so consequential that I am not sure what the long-term effect on Ukraine would be, whether the stability of Zelensky's government, of his entire regime, would withstand the blow. In the mid-1950s, during the First Indochina War between the French and the Vietnamese, the French conducted an offensive into Vietnamese-controlled territory, deep behind Vietnamese lines in a place called Dien Bien Phu. It was supposed to be a decisive blow that was going to shake the Vietnamese. Instead, what happened was that the Vietnamese recovered their balance and very quickly surrounded the French in Dien Bien Phu, and the French were forced eventually into a humiliating surrender. And that basically ended the war, the first Indochina War between the Vietnamese and the French. And to be honest, Kursk is beginning to look to me a little bit like a Ukrainian Dien Bien Phu. But anyway, maybe I'm allowing my historical memories to run away with me. Maybe the Ukrainians will pull out, retreat, but who knows? That, it seems to me, is the risk they run. Anyway, there are more rumblings in Kiev itself of suggesting political instability. The Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, an inconsequential figure who probably has his job because he is a Crimean Tatar, and the support of that community is very important to the Zelensky government. Anyway, there are rumblings that he might be forced to resign, but even more remarkable, there are now reports that Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, might be about to be sacked as well. Now, MK Badrukuma, the Indian commentator, has done a brilliant analysis and discussion of Budanov and the fact that if Zelensky sacks him, he's going to be taking on the CIA and MI6, at least Western intelligence agencies as well. And he also points out that, Budanov has been an extremely effective special forces commander and officer, which is true, by the way. He's been a terrible intelligence chief, in my opinion, but he's been a very successful, if that is the right word, special forces commander, the one whose various adventures, in my opinion, have achieved nothing useful for Ukraine. I'm going to discuss him in more detail, probably in my next video. But anyway, it's difficult to know, first of all, whether Budanov's position is really at risk. But if he is dismissed, it will be an act of enormous consequence. And maybe it's a mistake to assess both its likely causes and its outcomes before such a dismissal happens. But the very least that one could say is that if he is dismissed, it is a further sign of how fragile the situation in Kiev has become as defeat looms, and how insecure President Zelensky's position now is. Anyway, there we are, two very different wars being played out, one in the Middle East, one in Ukraine. One fought to the West's style, the other to the Russian. And they are there's a striking contrast and difference between the two. We will see what happens with the conflict in the Middle East. The conflict in Ukraine, we're moving ever closer towards a Russian victory, and there is nothing now, as far as I can see, that anybody can do to prevent it. Well, that is my program for today. First one, as I said, since Kuala Lumpur. I'm a bit ragged still after a long flight, so if it's been a bit incoherent in places, my apologies. But anyway, to repeat again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.